I caught it in the way he smiled when he thought no one was looking, not at my son, at the house. My name is not important right now. What matters is this. I am 63 years old. I live on 42 acres of apple orchard and open land in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, and last spring, I stood up in the middle of my son's rehearsal dinner and said things that changed everything. Some people in that room will never forgive me. I can live with that. Let me start where it actually started. My husband passed 11 years ago, pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal the way that disease always is. We had built everything together, the orchard, the farmhouse, the small cider business that grew from a hobby into something real. When he died, I didn't sell. I didn't downsize. I put on my work gloves and I kept going because that land was the last living thing we had made together and I was not going to let it go. My son, Beckett, was 22 when his father died. He handled it the way young men sometimes do, by going quiet and then going away. He moved to Portland, got his engineering degree, built a life there. We talked every Sunday. He came home for Thanksgiving and a few weeks every summer. We were close in the way that matters, even across distance. He met her 2 years ago at a friend's birthday party. Her name was Sienna. She was 31, worked in marketing, had a bright laugh and a way of touching Beckett's arm whenever she spoke to him that I noticed immediately. He was glowing when he introduced her to me. I had never seen my son look like that. I smiled and I meant it. The first time she came to the property, she stood on the porch and looked out at the orchard rows and said, "God, this place must be worth a fortune." I thought it was just a comment. People say things like that. I let it go. She came back 3 more times that year. Each visit, she asked questions. Not the curious kind, the cataloging kind. How many acres exactly? Was the cider business incorporated separately? Did I have a manager or did I run it myself? When I mentioned that I'd finally had the property formally appraised the previous fall, she leaned forward and asked what it had come in at. I told her I didn't really discuss that sort of thing. She laughed it off and said she was just curious, but I watched her eyes when we drove the property line in the truck. She wasn't looking at the trees or the mountain view to the east. She was looking at the fence posts. She was measuring. Beckett proposed to her in December. He called me first before he did it to tell me he was going to ask. I told him I was happy for him if he was happy. I meant that too, or I was trying to. He heard something in my voice. "Mom, you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just want you to be sure. I've never been more sure of anything." I said congratulations and I hung up and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. They set the date for the following October. A Friday evening rehearsal dinner at the farmhouse, ceremony and reception on Saturday at a vineyard about 12 miles up the road. Sienna had found the venue. It was beautiful, a restored barn with string lights and a view of the hills. I helped pay for it. I did not complain about that. What I did start paying attention to very carefully was the pattern. In February, about 2 months after the engagement, Sienna called me directly, not through Beckett, to ask if I had ever thought about putting the orchard into a family trust. She said she had been reading about estate planning and thought it might be a good idea for tax purposes, and that a family trust would protect the property and keep it from going through probate someday. She said she could connect me with a financial planner she knew. I thanked her and said I already had an estate attorney I worked with. In March, she mentioned casually that her father had been a contractor and that she knew a lot about property values in rural Oregon. She said the market had shifted and that if I ever wanted to do anything with a portion of the land, now might be a good time. In April, she called my family doctor's office. I found out because my doctor told me. He had called me himself, a little uncomfortable, to let me know that a woman identifying herself as Beckett's fiancée had called the front desk asking about my general health status and whether I had any cognitive concerns. He had not given her any information. Federal law prevented that, but he thought I should know. I sat with that for 2 days before I told anyone. I didn't tell Beckett right away. I needed to understand what I was dealing with first. I called my estate attorney, a woman I had worked with for years, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Audrey, I want you to let me make a call." She contacted a private investigator she trusted. Within 6 weeks, I knew more than I wanted to know. Sienna had been engaged once before to an older man in Sacramento. He was a widower, owned commercial real estate. They had been together for 18 months. 2 months before their wedding, he had changed his will to include her. 3 weeks before the wedding, she had ended the engagement, citing irreconcilable differences. He had spent 14 months in court trying to recover what had shifted in that window. He mostly succeeded, but not entirely. There was nothing criminal. There was no police record. There was just a pattern, and patterns tell you what you need to know. I did not confront Sienna. I did not call Beckett. I went to my attorney and we spent 2 months building a wall around everything I had. I updated my estate documents, every deed, every account, every business interest, restructured, clarified, locked. A revocable living trust with language that made it untouchable by any future spouse in a dissolution proceeding without a court order and a mountain of evidence. My attorney says the most thorough job she had done in a decade. I told her I had a reason to be thorough. I also set up a separate conversation with my accountant and had the cider business interest formally separated into its own LLC with documented ownership that predated the engagement by decades. There was nothing she could claim was commingled. There was nothing left ambiguous. And then I waited. I want to be clear about something. I loved my son. I love my son. Everything I did because I did not want him to lose what his father and I had spent our lives building. But I also knew that if I went to him with what I had found before the wedding, he might not believe me. He was in love. He was happy in a way he hadn't been since before his father got sick. I was afraid that if I pushed too hard too early, I would lose him along with everything else. So I watched, and I waited for him to see what I already saw. The rehearsal dinner was on a Thursday evening in October. We set up long tables on the back porch and in the yard, strung lights through the orchard, put out the good linens. Beckett's friends drove down from Portland. Sienna's family came in from Bend. Her mother was polite and a little remote. Her father shook my hand firmly and complimented the property twice in the first 10 minutes. Sienna that evening was radiant. She laughed at everything, touched Beckett's shoulder constantly, thanked me for the food and the space, and said the orchard looked like something out of a painting. She was good at this. I'll give her that. At one point, I went inside to get more serving dishes from the kitchen, and I heard her on the back staircase. She had slipped away from the party, talking on her phone. I stopped in the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But I heard her say quietly, "I know. The trust thing didn't work. But once we're married, Oregon is a community property adjacent state. My attorney says after 3 years of marriage, we have more options." I stood very still. She said, I know. I just need the ceremony to happen." I went back to the kitchen. I took the serving dishes. I went back outside and I smiled at every guest and I refilled everyone's wine and I gave a toast about how proud I was of my son and how glad I was that he had found someone who made him happy. I do not know how I did that. I still don't. That night, after everyone had left and Beckett had driven Sienna back to the inn where her family was staying, I sat at the kitchen table again. The same table where I had sat 11 years ago when my husband was in the hospital. The same table where I had sat the night Beckett called to tell me he was going to propose. I sat there with a cup of tea that went cold, and I thought very carefully about what came next. I was not going to let the wedding happen. Not like this. Not without Beckett knowing the truth. But I needed him to hear it at a moment when he could actually absorb it, not 5 minutes before he was supposed to walk down an aisle. The next morning, I asked Beckett to come to the farmhouse early, before the day got going. I told him I had something for him, a gift from his father's things I had been saving. That part was true. I did have something for him, a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather that his father had always meant to give him. I had been waiting for the right moment. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. I gave him the watch first. He held it for a long time, running his thumb across the case, and I saw his jaw tighten the way it does when he's trying not to cry. Then I told him everything. I did not dramatize it. I did not editorialize. I laid it out the way my attorney had helped me understand it. The phone call to my doctor, the Sacramento engagement, the conversation on the staircase, the legal research my attorney had confirmed about what her plan appeared to be. I put the investigator's report on the table, printed out, and I slid it across to him. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, when did you find out about Sacramento?" "May," I said. He looked at me. "You've been carrying this since May." I needed to be sure, and I needed to protect the property first. Whatever you decided, I didn't want the decision to cost you everything your father worked for. He picked up the report. He read it. He put it down. He picked it up again. I watched my son's face go through things I cannot fully describe. There was grief there. The particular grief of realizing that something you believed completely was not what you thought it was. I know that grief. I felt it the morning the doctors told us about my husband. That feeling of the floor going somewhere different than your feet expected. He said, I need to talk to her. I said, okay. He called Sienna and asked her to come to the farmhouse. He didn't tell her why. She arrived 40 minutes later in a sundress, her hair done for the day, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place in town. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw my face. Beckett showed her the investigator's report. What happened next I am going to tell you plainly, because I think you deserve the plain version. She did not break down. She did not confess. She looked at the report and she looked at Beckett, and she said, very calmly, that the Sacramento situation had been complicated and that her attorney had simply been laying out options for her and that she had never had any intention of following through on any of it. She said she loved him. She said I had always been suspicious of her and had been looking for reasons to ruin this. She was very good. I could see her recalibrating in real time, shifting the frame, trying to make this about me rather than about her, and I understood, watching her do it, exactly how she had gotten as far as she had. Beckett was quiet through all of it. He let her talk. He asked a few questions, calm, specific questions, the way his father used to ask questions when he already knew an answer but needed someone to say it out loud. When had she first spoken to her attorney about Oregon marital property law? What exactly had she meant when she said she needed the ceremony to happen? Had she reached out to my doctor's office, yes or no? She said the doctor's office call had been out of concern for my health. Beckett nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. Then he said, I'm not going to marry you today. She left without the coffee cups. The wedding venue had to be called. Beckett's friends who had driven down from Portland were already at the vineyard, setting things up. His best man handled most of it. I called Sienna's mother directly because I felt she deserved to hear something from me, and I told her simply that the wedding was not happening and that I was sorry. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I had wondered. I did not ask her what she had wondered about. In the weeks afterward, Beckett went back to Portland. We talked every Sunday, same as always, but the calls were shorter for a while. I understood he was grieving something. He needed to do that at his own pace. He came home for Thanksgiving. He walked the orchard with me in the morning before I started cooking, the way he used to do with his father. It was cold, proper November cold, the ground hard, the last of the apple leaves down. We didn't talk about Sienna. We talked about his father and about the cider season and about a young couple from Corvallis who had toured the orchard in September and asked if I would ever consider taking on a small partner operation. At the end of the walk, at the far fence line where the property borders the old Hendricks place, Beckett stopped and looked back at the farmhouse in the distance. He said, Dad would have seen it. I said he would have seen it faster than me. Beckett laughed, a real laugh, the first one in a while. He put his arm around my shoulders the way he used to when he was a teenager and thought he was being subtle about needing comfort. We walked back to the house. I made the turkey the way I always do, with the herb butter under the skin the way his father taught me. We ate at the kitchen table with 2 of his Portland friends who had nowhere else to go that year. Somebody brought a very good Oregon Pinot. We stayed at the table until almost midnight, talking about nothing and everything. Before Beckett went to bed, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at me for a moment. He said, Thank you for waiting until you were sure. I know that wasn't easy. I said, You're my son. I would have waited as long as it took. He nodded. He went upstairs. I washed the dishes in the quiet house, the same house where his father and I had built 40 years of a life, the same land, the same apple trees outside the window, the same cold Oregon dark pressing against the glass. I had protected it. For him, for his father, for whatever came next. That was enough. That has always been enough.